It was last February that I went to Belarus. I had been invited to go to Lithuania to speak to the parliament on the 20th anniversary of their independence from the Soviet Union, and took a separate trip into Minsk, Belarus, in a neighboring nation, because there was a political crisis. It was February, and since the presidential election in the December before, there had been a wholesale effort by Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, to imprison his political opponents. With so many significant events going on in the Middle East, there's an understandable risk that we lose sight of things happening in countries like Belarus. In Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, if you have the temerity to run for president or protest a fraudulent election, you'll find yourself thrown in a KGB jail, where you're likely going to face torture and harsh prison sentences. If this sounds like a throwback to the Cold War and the Soviet Union, that's exactly what it is. Not only is Belarus a throwback to the worst political abuses of the old Soviet era, but the government's enforcers of this bankrupt system still call their police the KGB. On Saturday, the Lukashenko regime continued its nightmare of totalitarian rule when it convicted one of the country's opposition presidential candidates and former foreign minister, Andrew Sanikov, to 5 years in prison. You see, Mr. Sanikov had the temerity to run against the dictator of Europe, Lukashenko. And because of that, even having lost the election, he's going to pay for it by spending 5 years in prison. This picture here, this photograph, shows Mr. Sanikov in the defendant's cage during his trial in the Belarusian capital of Minsk. They put him in a cage. Can anyone think of a more telling symbol of Lukashenko's tyranny than a sham court proceeding with a KGB cage? His crime: this man ran for president of his country. In December last year, after nearly 2 decades of unchecked power, Lukashenko decided he'd have an open election. In his words, an open election. Many took him at his word and decided they'd run for president. Apparently, Lukashenko didn't care for that idea. His idea of election is no one runs against you. So he staged a sham election and then arrested 5 of the 6 presidential candidates and more than 600 peaceful demonstrators after the election. I visited Belarus some weeks afterwards, met with the family members of these brave candidates and activists, and I've got to tell you, it was a moving experience. The meetings included members of Mr. Sanikov's family. This was a photo which we took in the office of the U.S. consulate in Minsk in Belarus. It shows Konstantin Sanikov, Ali Sanikova, and Luciano Kalip. Konstantin and Alla are Mr. Sanikov's son and mother. Alla told me in tears that her son's arrest led to no contact between him and his family for weeks, and they denied him a lawyer. After he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, she told Radio Liberty she was proud of her son, that he'd, quote, suffered so much for the sake of Belarus. The judicial system has steamrolled our family, she said. Lucina is the grandmother of the candidate's 3-year-old son, Daniel. I wanted to put this photo up because Lukashenko decided it wasn't enough to throw this boy's father into prison. He basically said that they were going to remove this boy from the family as part of the punishment they were going to impose on him for running for president in that country. You see, not only did they arrest Sanikov, but they arrested his wife too. She was a journalist and therefore automatically suspect in Belarus. Even more despicably, they tried to take custody of this little boy who was staying with his grandmother. Now, what kind of cruel mind is so afraid of free expression of ideas that they would go after this little boy to further punish the parents, the father who had the nerve to run for president, the mother who had the nerve to publish in some underground publication any article critical of Lukashenko? President Lukashenko's repression and totalitarian regime have been condemned around the world. Asset freezes and travel bans have been placed on his enablers and police state enforcers. This Senate and the European Parliament both have passed sweeping resolutions condemning the regime, calling for new legitimate elections and release of all political prisoners. And the families of the detained, the Senate, the European Parliament, and the National Hockey League Hall of Famer Pete Stastny have called on the International Ice Hockey Federation to suspend its Belarus-hosted 2014 Ice Hockey Championship until all political prisoners are unconditionally released. A dictator such as Lukashenko should not be rewarded the international prestige of an event while prisoners languish in prison for simply exercising their human rights. I think it's time for the International Criminal Court prosecutor to look into Lukashenko's regime, most notably for the allegations of torture. I'm going to conclude by simply saying I want Mr. Sannikov and his many brave colleagues in Belarus and their families to know that the United States will stand by them in their effort to bring a peaceful democracy to this great nation of Belarus. We commend their bravery and let them know that they are not forgotten.